Good morning. Welcome to this circle. Whoever you are, however old or young you are, whatever your circumstances are, whatever brings you here today, however you've arrived in this space, you are welcome and you belong and you have a place, and we are community with each other. We're here in the midst of all that life is right now to build a community of hope, to energize one another in the midst of discouraging times, disheartening times. We gather knowing that we gather on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, traveling route for Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Nakota Sioux peoples. And as we gather, we're mindful of all of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. As we gather with an intention into which we live each day to find ways to mend the wounds of our history and to be about reconciling ways with one another. In this flame, we see both continuance and fragility. We see both persistence and also resistance. As we light this candle today, we come into the light of a new day, mindful that we live in a universe of movement, and we live on a planet of movement, a planet that is moving out into the universe and is moving around its sun and is moving on its own axis. And we are living lives where we are ever moving out of all that has been into all that can still be. We come into this day turning with each other toward light, wherever we find it, finding it within ourselves, in the light of one another, in the eyes of the stranger, in the stories that are part of our tradition, in the stories that are part of other traditions, in the natural world. And in this day, we turn into the light of a new beginning, ever turning from hate to hope. We come here to strengthen our intentions, to live in ways that will turn the world toward loving, toward healing, toward becoming whole. And so I invite us as we gather with one another to speak those intentions, to pray with one another in words that we see before us. Into this place we gather seeking truth, listening beyond words for the rhythm of the sacred. We gather seeking solace for losses that are too heavy to bear. We gather seeking mercy, for we find within our own hearts the presence of shadow. We gather seeking justice, for there are too many walls shutting out the light. We gather seeking partners to celebrate the goodness of life. Yet too, we gather to share the things our lives have found to be true. We gather to heal and shoulder burdens not our own. We gather to forgive, freeing each other into hope and new life. We gather to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who must no longer stand alone. Into this place we come so that we can rehearse love, practice compassion, plan just action, and promote radical hospitality. As those who walk a common road, we live that it may be so.
From a work by Howard Zinn, this reading is entitled, "You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train." To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. In the words of this historian, academic, and activist, may we find wisdom for our living.
From the words of the poet William Stafford, a ritual to read to each other. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world. And following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel. And maybe the root of all cruelty to know what occurs, but not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. Or signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. In the insight of this poet,
a reading now with a different tone from the ancient Israel, from the people of ancient Israel and the writings of the Hebrew people. This comes from the book of Exodus in the first chapter. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we can handle. Let's devise a plan to contain them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, will join with our enemies and fight against us and escape this land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and treated them worse than ever. They made them miserable, making bricks and mortar and doing every kind of backbreaking labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, she shall live." But the midwives did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. In this ancient story of fear, hatred, and resistance, may we find wisdom for our living.
For a few short minutes tomorrow, day will become night. The sun, the moon, and the earth will line up in such a way that the sun will be completely eclipsed by the moon. And darkness will be experienced across its path. As we know, it's going to be most fully experienced in a swath some 70 miles wide along a path that'll stretch across several of the United States, from Oregon to South Carolina. And within the path that will experience the totality of the eclipse, the day will seem as dark as a moonlit night. But in the events that have moved across our planet this week, it seems to me that the world is already experiencing a path of total eclipse. These are days that have been darkened by hatred and violence, and the light of peace and diplomacy has been darkened by reckless speech that's threatened nuclear disaster. We've been witnessing the dark path of a nation wielding sanctions and threatening war on an oil-producing nation and dictating its vision of democracy. This is a time when the light of our best humanity is threatened by the darkness of prejudice and fear and ignorance. A time when rhetoric and hateful acts make cars into weapons and bring violent confrontations into the streets to assert superiority. It's a time that calls for more than special glasses to witness what's happening. It's a time like the time that poet described, when our mutual life could be lost in the dark. A time when it's important that awake people be awake. It's so tempting to sleep through the eclipse of love by hate, the eclipse of the dream of coexistence with ugly claims of superiority, the eclipse of peace with violence. It's so tempting to close our eyes and hope that we'll wake up into a better time. But maybe our refusal to surrender our consciousness is our first act of resistance. Spiritual teachers like the Buddha and like Jesus sought to instill in their followers the need to stay awake. And sometimes that's the only thing that's in our power to do. Sometimes all that is within our power is to refuse to close our eyes to the painful truth of privilege, to refuse to close our eyes to the ugly realities of racism and sexism and heterosexism and ageism and capitalism and countless other isms, to refuse to close our eyes to the fragility of freedom, the loss of civility, the poison of hate, and that dangerous divide of deep poverty and extreme wealth. It's hard to stay present to the world as it is. It's hard to stay awake, to resist the temptation to close our eyes and thus to close our hearts. There's never been a more important time for stories, because stories have the power to save us from smaller versions of ourselves. I think that's what draws me to that little vignette in the ancient story of an Exodus that Chris read for us a moment ago. It's the beginning of a kind of meta-narrative, a beat-the-odds kind of story, a come-from-behind underdog success that can inspire the best in us. It's an archetypal story about freedom. It's not history. What's of enduring value in this story, it's not that it's about bad Egyptians and good Hebrews. It's not about a God who saves a preferred people by drowning their enemies. It isn't about the history of any part of the world. It's the classic tale of oppression and freedom which we have experienced in our humanity again and again and again. It's a folk tale that an oppressed people told their children and their children's children to shape their identity and to shore up their courage. Beyond cultivating an identity for an ancient Semitic people, we know this tale of Exodus fueled the kind of we shall overcome resistance that inspired the anti-slavery movement and the anti-segregation movement and the civil rights movement and the anti-apartheid movement and so many activist movements for social change. And we generally make Moses the hero of this story. You know, we think of him as that legendary freedom fighter who got his people out of harm's way. But the tale, as we're given it, begins with the story of a few courageous women who resist the cruel and racist policies of their governing power. It's really the story of a kind of grassroots resistance to an edict that was rooted in a racist ideology that was going to end in genocide. It's the story of a fearful lawmaker who's threatened by the potential of a population explosion among the foreign workers in his country. If they become the majority, they would have the capacity to assert themselves, to gain equality, and maybe even seize the reins of power. It's the story of a pharaoh and administration who sees that the exploited labor force of migrants could reach a point where they'll no longer just simply accept their lot in life. And what will happen when they begin to assert themselves? It's the story of ordinary people, not extraordinarily powerful people, ordinary women, ordinary individuals who find ways to resist, to subvert, to confront, to challenge the status quo and the injustice that they see around them. So into the world of this ancient imagination come two women, at least two women, two who are named, who refuse to carry out the king's orders to kill the male children of the foreign workers. The story tells us they're midwives. They attend to the women of the disadvantaged community when they're giving birth. And the story doesn't tell us much about them. We don't get to hear how they organized their resistance. We don't get to hear how widespread this movement was. We don't get to hear anything about how coordinated their efforts were. The story just gives us the name of two of the midwives and the excuse that they give to the administration for their failure to succeed in eliminating his problem. They say they just don't get there in time to prevent these children from being born alive. We learn nothing of their fate. All that lives on in this story is the simple model of peaceful, creative, civil disobedience, which is highly effective in subverting Pharaoh's inhumane order. Moses ultimately gets all the credit for leading the liberation. But really the movement succeeds because of the birthers, those who were daring to bring children into this dangerous time, and those who helped them succeed in their acts of resistance. And then the story goes on to create 3 more characters who are key to the resistance. There will be the subversive mother who places her threatened child into the waters of the Nile, to be watched by his very own sister, who will hide until another woman, a privileged woman, the daughter of the very one who ordered all children like this to be killed, until she comes along and draws him out of the water and raises him as her own child. The child, the story will hail as the hero. The Moses who survived and thrived and defied. That each of these women was an activist in her own right. Each did something she could do, something that was within her power and imagination to resist and to subvert the unjust law. When the best of our humanity is eclipsed by the shadows of the worst of ourselves, some midwives will always take to the streets in peaceful protest. Some will run for office with a vision of greater fairness and inclusion. Some will employ art and music to keep the light of hope and justice burning. Some will refuse to laugh at a racist joke. Some will risk relationships with their family and friends to take a stand against the hatred and to speak for love and equality. Because all of us can do something to keep ourselves awake. We can all refuse to be neutral on a moving train. Like Howard Zinn reminded us, what we see in this complex time will determine much. And if we see only the worst, we'll be paralyzed. But if we'll be inspired by those, and there will always be many, who behave magnificently, we'll find the energy to live the best of our humanity. Resistance is a spiritual practice. We have so many mentors who've taught us to seek justice and resist evil, to resist the distortions to our humanity. And change will come, and it will come as it has always come, midwifed by those who have the courage to resist what's unfair, what's unkind, what's unjust, whether it's lawful or not. As our Aboriginal brothers and sisters have sought to teach us in Idle No More, and our youth have taken to the streets in the Occupy movement and the environmental movement and the animal rights movement, there are so many ways to resist. By what we buy and what we refuse to buy, by how we place our vote as citizens and as shareholders, by how we invest and divest our money, by how we refuse to be silent, and how and where and with whom we place our voice and our lives. Today's a day to ask ourselves, what do we need to do with each other to keep each other awake? What do we need to do to help each other resist the temptation to close our eyes and our ears and our hearts?
We have the privilege in these summer Sundays to have the time to share with one another and to connect and to build community in different ways as we share our lives and our world with one another. And today, our invitation is to ponder and consider those places in our lives where we would wish to share our worries, our fears, those places in our lives and in our world where love and justice is needed. As we share those with one another, we'll share the response together. After we hear the words, amid our worries and fears, we'll respond, may love light our way.
One of my main concerns of what is happening in the world is that terrorism has become such an issue and dealt with as the problem when it is a symptom of the poverty and unemployment and injustice and all that goes with it in this world. Amid our worries and fears,
may love light our way.
Despite all that we've done to address homelessness in Edmonton, I continue to be worried about housing needs for people that need supportive housing and for large families that still have big challenges in finding adequate housing.
Amid our worries and fears.
Love and justice is certainly required for our Native families and Native friends in this community. They've suffered over many, many years and continue to suffer in today's world. They certainly require love and justice.
Amid our worries and fears, may love light our way. For these and all the prayers that remain in our hearts and the challenges and the worries that we have for our world, may we join together in knowing that amid our worries and fears, may love light our way. Friends, the path of love is taken one step at a time, be it a small step or a large one. We each spread that love in our life's journey. One breath, one word, one small act at a time. May the love that we share with each other go with us and spread like a flame into the world, and may it make a difference in all that we do.